Good morning, afternoon, evening to everybody on the call. Thank you so much for being in this lunch session. This presentation is going to be talking about improving customer segmentation for watch marketing, tools and examples for practitioners and researchers. My name is James Harper. I'm a freelance watch researcher, and this presentation was developed in collaboration with Chris Nicoletti of IDE. Some of the research that I'm going to be presenting here was also done while I was a graduate student at the University of Colorado at Boulder. So first off, what is customer segmentation and why do we care about it? So segmentation groups a target population by relevant similarities in a specific context about a given product or service. So there are four different groupings of these relevant similarities that we can kind of tend to think about. So demographics is a pretty common one. So age, gender, marital status of an individual can affect how they desire or will pay for or perceive a product or a service. So those different demographics might be relevant to understanding how they might be thinking about a product or service. A little bit less tangible would be something like a psychographic characteristic, so the culture, traditions, values, or attitudes of an individual. Geographic location is also another really common similarity amongst people. Obviously, they're living in the same place. That is a similarity. However, it also has relevance to marketing aspects, so distribution of a product or a service. So that could be a relevant way to segment a population. And lastly, behavioral, so past actions, preferences, and perceptions about the specific product or service that you're looking at or something related. So having understood what segmentation is, what does it actually do for us? So the biggest thing that it'll likely do is improve marketing performance. And that's simply being able to target the right people with the right messaging at the right time. Also, informing product or service development is another really common thing that customer segmentation can help us with. These two in particular, I'm going to be giving two different examples of two different research projects later here in the presentation. Also, segmentation can help us identify new areas of expansion, focus on the product, service, or business's goals, and also inform other marketing decisions like the price of a product or service or its distribution region. So the process of segmentation is simply identifying which of those similarities in those four different groups are relevant to a specific product or service in a specific context. Now, this might sound simple enough, but it is particularly difficult. So typically you would start with looking at past research, ideally peer-reviewed research, to try to understand, has someone else studied this before? Is it related? Is my product or service perhaps too different from what's existing in the research and I need to do new research? Okay, and that's most common. Usually starting out with something like qualitative interviews, moving up to quantitative surveys. But ideally you would perform some type of experiment to really understand if your customer segmentation matters to this particular product or service in this context or not. So I'm going to be giving you two examples. One is a randomized control trial and the other is a discrete choice experiment. So first off, looking at the first example, IDE and I wanted to understand what do households in rural Cambodia value in fecal sludge management services. So we used a discrete choice experiment to describe what households prefer, what do they value in these FSM services. So rural FSM services are typically performed using unsafe practices. And a trained professional service is one pathway to provide safe FSM in these rural contexts. Now, professional FSM services could take two different pathways, following typical sanitation value chain of empty, transport, treat, and dispose or reuse of fecal sludge from primarily pit latrines, or simply installing a new pit to create something like an alternating dual pit system to provide on-site sanitation. So the market and methods that are used by FSM service providers is going to depend on the household's valuation of those services. So we ask the question, which attributes of FSM services do rural households prefer? So using a discrete choice experiment, we describe the stated preferences and willingness to pay for different FSM service attributes. We described FSM services using 5 different attributes, and you can see them here in the rows. So the first being, does the service prevent contact with fecal sludge for everyone? Can the fecal sludge fertilize crops after emptying? how disgusting is the smell produced by the service, how many days pass between service request and service delivery, and what is the cost of the service. And you can see that these attributes are described by different levels using imagery as well as text, and that's to mitigate any issues of literacy in our respondent pool. So each household was asked 5 questions that looked like this. So you can see those same 5 attributes describing options A and B, and then there's a third option, C, which I'll talk about here in a second. So the question was simply select one of these 3 options based on your preference. Which one of these 3 do you prefer? The attributes levels for options A and B varied by question using a blocked fractional factorial design. And then option C is, you can think of it as the neither option. I don't really want a service, I want to do my own thing. So this was informed by a question that we asked to each household: what would you do if no FSM service were available? So training is a really important part of discrete choice experiments. So we trained 16 enumerators using, starting out with video tutorials and then moving on to in-person role playing, where enumerators would both ask and then answer the questions in the discrete choice experiment in order to hone both their presentation skills and so that we as a group could hone the questions and instructions for the experiment. Then we moved on to pilot testing, which occurred in 5 villages in order to improve question clarity. So we got feedback from real rural Cambodian household members, and we were able to modify the question wording and imagery based on that feedback. And enumerators also provided feedback from that testing as well. So the results of the study showed that preferences were found for all of the attributes that we tested. So you can see here that we were plotting model coefficient on the vertical axis and the attributes on the horizontal axis, and higher means more preference. So in the study, there were 1,461 respondents, and we found the strongest preference for preventing contact with fecal sludge. I'm going to turn on my laser pointer here, followed by being able to use fecal sludge as fertilizer and then reducing smell. So you can see that the preference for preventing contact with fecal sludge has a model coefficient of near 2, whereas the preference for using fecal sludge as fertilizer has a model coefficient near 1. That means that rural households generally prefer preventing contact with fecal sludge approximately twice as much as being able to use fecal sludge as fertilizer. You'll also note this relatively small bar over here with reduced number of days till service delivery. This is describing the preference for reducing the number of 1 day until service delivery. So a faster service is actually preferred comparably to using fecal sludge as fertilizer when this time to service delivery reaches 4 weeks or 30 days. So you can imagine increasing this bar by 30 to reach this guy here. You'll also notice the error bars on the graph. Those indicate significant standard deviations and what's called preference heterogeneity. So what we're showing here are effectively average values across the entire population of 1,461 households, but an individual household is likely to have slightly different preferences based on this heterogeneity that we're seeing. So the impact from our discrete choice experiments, it gives us confidence in saying that we really should be developing safe emptying practices that allow fecal sludge to be used as fertilizer and also reducing the smell during that FSM service. That is what the results show that people care about. So this allows us to consider different business models and train service providers appropriately. It also helps us to target the marketing of FSM services. So for example, a slogan like "Hire us to keep your household safe and your property fertile" is likely to be more effective than something like "Our service is fast and discreet." So this is an example of customer segmentation that gives us a lot of information about what people value about a particular service, fecal sludge management services in this case. And then we would actually go out and see if these had effects in terms of the actual marketing here. So the other example I wanted to talk to you about is completely separate from the discrete choice experiment, unfortunately. I wish I had a lot more time, obviously, to talk about these. But another study that IDE ran in rural Cambodia looked at targeting subsidies for latrines in order to increase sales, particularly to poor households. So IDE recognized that poor households were either unable or unwilling to purchase a latrine. And so they decided to target subsidies based on the ID Poor system in Cambodia. It's a national system that identifies poor households and non-poor households. So IDE gave a 44% discount to ID Poor 1 households, a 22% discount to ID Poor 2 households, and no discount to non-ID Poor households. And they actually ran a randomized control trial using 83 control villages and 83 treatment villages. And the results of the study showed that sales increased by approximately 17 and 15% in ID Poor 1 and 2 households when offered targeted subsidies, and 14% overall in villages where subsidies were offered. It's just a pretty amazing results, given the relatively basic customer segmentation simply based on poverty level. And lastly, they also looked at market distortion effects. So they found that targeted subsidies do not decrease sales to non-ID Poor households. So based on this simple customer segmentation based on poverty level, they were able to run an experiment and show that this is a valid way to segment the population and increase latrine sales using targeted subsidies. So an example of the power of customer segmentation. So to wrap up in summary, segmentation starts by identifying relevant similarities among customers in a given context, using ideally past and then new research. And selecting the tools to do that is really important for your particular project. Then you move on to targeting, marketing, and product service development based on the results of that research. And then lastly, it's really important to report your results, ideally in peer-reviewed open access journals so that we can all learn from what you've done. So thanks for listening to that relatively fast presentation. I look forward to answering any questions that you might have.